So I'll just... Oh. Okay. Is my sound is on. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this session. Nyliberalismens slutt og strategier for sosiale bevegelser. The end of neoliberalism and strategies for social movements. This session will be held in English. My name is Yngve Heiret. I will be chairing the session. And neoliberalism has been a central theme for this year's globaliseringskonferansen. We have had several meetings about the history of neoliberalism, the present of neoliberalism, and now we will also go on to talk about the future of neoliberalism. And there are mainly two reasons for this focus on neoliberalism for this year's conference. On the one side, we have the neoliberal intellectual network Montpellier Society gathering next weekend here in Oslo at the Hotel The Hub at Jernbanetorget to organize their 75th general meeting with the title Liberal Institutions and International Order Renewing the Infrastructure of Liberalism, or of Liberty. Montpellier Society's gathering here in Oslo next week urges and compels us, the Norwegian left, to discuss the role and the meaning of Montpellier Society, but also the role and meaning of neoliberalism more generally, here in Norway and globally. And on the other hand, the debates about neoliberalism have also turned. They've taken a new turn recently and in recent years. Neoliberalism has always been a contested concept, and whereas in the 1990s and 2000s, the debates about neoliberalism were largely about the nature of neoliberalism, what is neoliberalism, and how has neoliberalism evolved differently in different national, regional, and local contexts. Whereas today, and in recent years, the debate about neoliberalism, at least on the left, has to a certain extent been more about the future viability of this way of organizing capitalism. Neoliberalism has been hegemonic for several decades, and it has been a taken for granted way of organizing politics in which the scope of politics has been reduced to a minimum. But the tides are turning. After the 2008 financial crisis, when it became evident that the neoliberal dream of self-regulated markets is nothing more than an abstract illusion, human geographer Jamie Peck famously stated that we were entering a time of zombie neoliberalism, in which neoliberalism was dead but still dominant. Today, 12 years later, we see tendencies toward erasing the last part of Peck's phrase. Neoliberalism is simply dead, many states. British economist James Meadway, which is here to discuss these issues with us today, is among those who argue that neoliberalism has come to an end. In a piece in Open Democracy from 2021, he argued that neoliberalism is dying, if not yet dead. And this raises important questions, such as what will replace neoliberalism? What are the drivers behind these changes, and what implications do they have for socialist strategies? So with us to discuss this, we have James Meadway coming from Britain. Meadway is the director at Progressive Economy Forum and has previously been the economic advisor for the British Shadow Chancellor for Labour. So James will talk for roughly 40-45 minutes before we open for comments from Hege Skarre, who is a political economist and columnist for Klassekampen. She was until recently the leader of ATTAC and is now political advisor for the Socialist Left Party here in Norway. And we will also have comments from Hagen Schultz-Forberg, who is a conceptual historian and associate professor at Aarhus University, and who has for many years worked with the conceptual history of neoliberalism. So please welcome James Meadway.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for the... it's always worrying when people clap before you start, you know, but see what you make of it by the end. So, well, thank you for the welcome and the introduction there. I suppose I'm slightly apprehensive that one of the respondents is a conceptual historian and somebody who deals with the idea of neoliberalism, because part of my argument, I suppose, is that we probably, the left collectively, has ended up spending too long thinking about neoliberalism as a concept, as an idea, as a set of ideas that people have and that are imposed on us, and not long enough thinking about it as a strategy for government, or as a set of institutions, or as a set of practices that are created by those institutions and by those governments. That we have a story or a version of neoliberalism that tends to look at institutions like the Mont Pelerin Society and say, okay, these people had their terrible ideas from the end of the Second World War, during this great period of Keynesianism, of social democracy, of the expansion of governments across the West in particular, of a kind of stabilization of capitalism with high rates of growth, rapid improvements in the standard of living for most people. That during this time, the Mont Pelerin Society were the last true believers camped out on their Swiss mountain. And then in the 1970s, there's a crisis, the social democratic settlement falls apart, and they kind of turn up and impose neoliberalism. And there's elements of truth to this. There's a degree to which that is actually correct. If you take Britain, Margaret Thatcher was advised pretty directly by Friedrich von Hayek. Think tanks set up by people from the Mont Pelerin Society or around the Mont Pelerin Society, like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, were influential in setting the direction of her government from 1979 onwards. And there's a similar thing happens in the US, that in the Anglo-Saxon world is kind of where neoliberal ideas were pushed furthest, where you had governments that most actively pursued this way of working. But it's not these governments that we should think about if we think about what neoliberalism is in practice, how it comes to dominate the way the world economy is structured. That there is, if you like, a kind of heroic period for neoliberalism. There's a point in time where, when the crisis of the social democratic Keynesian order arrives, and really this is building up from the end of the 1960s, that the period of growth again in Western capitalism was coming to an end, that the demands being placed on the system by the workers' movement, which had increased markedly in strength during this period of boom, that it's worth digging out. It's a very good essay by the Polish economist Michał Kalecki on the political aspects of full employment, that when you have full employment and capitalism loses the threat of unemployment against workers, you have a much reinforced workers' movement. You have people able to organize and create demands much more effectively than they would have done otherwise. The threat of unemployment is gone. So that is a strain in the system in the 60s. that you have the emergence of multinational corporations during this period of time that start to impose their own demands on how the system should operate. Multiple strains that appear, which then end up with something that 20 or 30 years later, by the 2000s, we can say is the neoliberal order that's been created out of this crisis, that is recognizably a different world to the world that existed in the 1970s. But it's a process of struggle to get there. That if you have a government like Margaret Thatcher's in Britain or Ronald Reagan's in the US, or to a weaker extent across Europe during the 1980s, that these are governments that try and impose versions of a resolution to the crisis of the 60s and 70s into the 80s. But it's a continual fight for them. That this is not that they have their ideas and here are the institutions that's imposed, that they have to struggle for it. That classically in Britain, the National Union of Mine Workers was set up and defeated in a year-long strike by the Thatcher government. It's a fight, and that strike wasn't necessarily going to lose. That neoliberalism in this period, neoliberal governments in this period are waging a battle. That they're fighting to go and achieve something. They're fighting to reorder how the world operates. That's the heroic period of neoliberalism. And often, I think if you're on the left in your heads, you'll tend to think of neoliberalism as this heroic battle, as a continual class battle, as something where the government is out there and continually trying to push and force and change what is happening in the world. That it's about class struggle. And that is what the neoliberal thinkers really come down to. This is what the neoliberal thought collective stands for. So it's the idea of a struggle and then going into action with that struggle. I think this is kind of the wrong way to think about things. I think it's giving too much credence to neoliberals themselves because it makes them sound like heroic warriors for a great cause from their point of view. From our point of view, they're not heroic warriors for a great cause. These are all terrible people to a greater or lesser extent. But it's giving them too much credit to say that, yes, this is a heroic battle that you're waging all the time. That actually, if we think about the history of neoliberalism, we need to first stop thinking so much about what happens at a national level and start thinking about what happens internationally. That the triumph of neoliberalism is not so much the creation of governments that behave in a neoliberal way, that they batter trade unions, they create markets for everything, that they tear up what they can of the welfare states. They try and create societies that are nationally oriented on the market. It's what happens internationally. That when you get institutions that operate internationally that can impose these sets of neoliberal rules and that have the power and the capacity to do this, that you do have an international intellectual property regime that functions, that will effectively impose patents on drugs, on genetically modified crops, on many, many aspects of our sort of social and material life you can claim a copyright over or a patent over, and that will be enforced. This is a triumph of neoliberalism. That when you have the World Trade Organization, when it operated effectively, to be able to say we will tear down barriers to free trade across the world, always skewed, of course, towards the major countries and the US in particular. That when you get institutions like that operate globally and that they are effective in what they do, this is a triumph of neoliberalism. It makes, by the way, one of the key points of neoliberalism, not so much Margaret Thatcher arriving in power in 1979 in Britain, or even Augusto Pinochet in 73 and 72 in Chile. It means that the key moment in neoliberalism, the peak of this system, was China's entry into the World Trade Organization in the 2000s, which paves the way for this incredible expansion of the market for producer goods, for labor, right the way across the world, and sets up the consumer boom of that period. So this is the peak of neoliberalism. In other words, is not the heroic struggle, it's the rather tedious managerial period afterwards. That the triumph of neoliberalism is about the bureaucracy. Not the fight, but what the bureaucrats do when the fight is over. That after you've defeated the miners, that after the Berlin Wall has been torn down, that after you've destroyed what you can of the welfare state, neoliberalism is what you get afterwards. It's the boring bit. It's the period when you have bureaucratic rules and regulations everywhere. They function in a certain way. There's no heroic struggle because the working class has been defeated in successive fights across the globe. And that's the triumph of neoliberalism. The most neoliberal leaders were not Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They had to fight. They weren't able to win everything. They got most things. They didn't win everything. The most neoliberal leaders, at least in the West, were people like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, people who just managed the system. There's nothing heroic about them. They just sort of sit there and everything runs, and that's neoliberalism. This is the world order we now live with. So that I think is first the sort of shift that we need to get into if we're talking about the history of neoliberalism. It's not a heroic set of ideas and a valiant fight for the interests of the ruling class. It's a load of bureaucrats managing a system in a certain way. That you say laws can be applied internationally, globally, property regime can be applied internationally and globally. The price mechanism is what's going to organize not just this nation, but an entire global economy. And at the center of that boring managerial neoliberalism, the peak of neoliberalism is the creation of some peak neoliberal institutions, which I'd argue that the major banks, the major financial institutions are the most obvious. That if you get down to what are the rules by which this neoliberal order operates, what are the conditions, what are the principles that are applied everywhere, that you say we have a set of laws and regulations and principles that are applied across the world that relate to the existence, the rule of law and property rights, and these are extended right the way across the world, and national governments will recognize what is happening internationally. That's one principle. The other one is that we say everywhere we want markets and price mechanism to organize how society functions. That you say if something exists and there's a legal claim to its existence, so it could be your patent for your vaccine or whatever it might be, then there will be a market that can trade that, and this market will function everywhere it can. These are the two principles of the bureaucratic management of neoliberalism, and the organizations that most embody them are the major banks and the big financial institutions, because they depend entirely on the existence of those two conditions. That if you take the period in the run-up to the 2008 crash, it's the banks, it's the Lehman Brothers, it's Goldman Sachs, it's these huge financial institutions that depend critically on a legal regime that can function everywhere, that they can create, for instance, something wild like a collateralized debt obligation, incredible, complex packages of financial instruments and derivatives mashed up together, designed to produce as much money as possible in as short a time as possible, but that only function if you have a legal regime that works nationally and it's recognized internationally. And that they have to be traded in a market that will only function if there's a price that can be applied to them. So the huge banks, the big financial institutions, the peak neoliberal organizations in private capitalism alongside that period of time. That's neoliberalism. It's not the heroism, it's not the fight, it's not the exciting stuff like the miners' strike or whatever, it's the boring stuff that comes afterwards. That's what neoliberalism looks like. And once you start to think of it like that, it becomes clearer that this regime, which had been stabilized, I would say, by the 2000s through to the 2008 crisis, is now on its way out in various different forms. It'd be hard not to talk about what's happening in Britain at the minute in relation to that, because this is an incredible negative demonstration of the point that we have just got. It's not elected, the sort of bizarre, not very democratic setup that we have back in the United Kingdom means that there's no election to change the Prime Minister. It's just something that sort of happens inside the Conservative Party every so often. Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, arrives after a long but very strange and ill-reported leadership contest inside the Conservative Party, with the promise and the aspiration that she would be a second Margaret Thatcher. I mean, quite deliberately aping the style, down to dressing the same as Margaret Thatcher. That she would go out and be a heroic neoliberal, advised by the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, the same gang of think tanks that was there in the 1970s and 1980s, advised by these people to make the final push for a truly neoliberal society in Britain. That you would cut taxes for the very richest, you would, somewhere down the line, really destroy whatever's left of the welfare state, and that's the plan that's starting to emerge, that you would deregulate everything possible, that it'll be a heroic struggle against goodness knows who, the trade unions, the struggle's picking up a bit, but it's hardly the 1980s. It'll be a heroic struggle, and you'd win, and out of this fight would emerge a new neoliberal order. That was the plan. And on Friday, the first bit of it was put in place, last Friday, when the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, announced a sweeping range of tax cuts for mostly and extraordinarily aimed at the very wealthiest, the top 1%, the top 0.1% would do best out of this, and ran immediately into a set of international institutional reactions that are now pushing the government into crisis. That financial markets, the supposed beneficiaries of this heroic struggle that was going to be waged by this government, in fact, rejected entirely the budget. They don't believe the government's promises implied in the tax cuts that they'll be able to cut the welfare state, and as a result, the pound has gone into a free fall against the dollar, and the cost of government borrowing in Britain has gone through the roof. That this is a panic in the financial markets in reaction to this dramatic reversion to neoliberal values by the government. This attempt to push neoliberalism has produced this response from financial markets. To follow this up, earlier in the week, you had the International Monetary Fund, one of the organizations most associated with the heroic period of neoliberalism, the management of neoliberalism thereafter, turning around and saying, we don't approve of this budget, not least because it's very unequal. It's going to create more inequality. A core institution of the neoliberal order, as it was, saying that we reject this attempt at a heroic return to neoliberalism. What we have, instead, stepping back from this picture, is that the British government currently looks like an outlier relative to what is happening in the rest of the world. That the international reaction, to say nothing of the domestic horror when confronted with this program, has been aversely against an attempt to return to a neoliberal order. So what does it look like if we say, okay, this was neoliberalism, or it still is, but it's not functioning in quite the same way that it used to? I think there's probably three elements that are coming through quite dramatically on this. The first is this obvious turn that you could see in 2008 with the crisis, but a return to state intervention in various forms. That when the financial crisis happened, the need to stabilize the system, to get these peak institutions of neoliberalism, the major financial institutions, get them functioning again, requires state intervention on a massive scale, particularly huge in Britain, but vast everywhere that you had a financial system that was teetering at the time. This was both a direct spending intervention by governments and then this peculiar indirect intervention by central banks. Key institutions of viewed as the key institutions of the neoliberal order, now having to act against the neoliberal order for the purposes, as they saw it at the time, of rescuing it. But 10, 12 years down the line, very clear that what emerges from this is a changed relationship between the central banks, between the state and the major financial institutions. So there's a series of interventions that start to appear there. That you have, in the midst of all this, from the peak of neoliberalism onwards, accelerating in relative terms after 2008, that when Western capitalism plunges into this major crisis, when growth doesn't return, you have the growth very dramatically of China and its rise to at least second largest economy in the world status. Very, very rapid growth, driven by a government that was not desperately concerned with observing the international neoliberal rules of the game. That they were quite happy to intervene successively and dramatically to support particular industries, to invest in huge infrastructure projects, both in China and outside, to manage the domestic financial system in the interests of the government as it would see it. That he was integrated into the neoliberal world order, but had never entirely acted in neoliberal fashion. And that this was a success. And that this was a success relative to those countries that had pursued neoliberalism most aggressively. They'd been forced in the 2008 crisis to introduce more elements of state control. The rise of China, seen now in Washington in the language they use as a peer competitor for the first time in America's history. There is a country that can effectively compete with America in a range of critical economic and technological areas, right the way across the spectrum of of the economy, that this is the first time a peer competitor has emerged, acting not in a neoliberal way, is producing a response across the Western world, led, I would say, in particular by the US, and in particular by the government of Donald Trump, who quite directly says China is a competitor, we will therefore have to break the rules, the neoliberal rules, to prevent China being out-competing us. We will therefore have to rewrite the trade rules and rip up the trade rules and impose tariffs, impose sanctions, block Chinese companies from using technology from the US, or block Chinese companies from entering the US with their technology, and therefore start to tear up the neoliberal rules of the game. The Biden administration has done exactly the same thing, and even deepened and extended this into saying, well, okay, we will now reintroduce industrial strategy in America for semiconductors in particular, potentially for the car industry and other interventions on this scale. So this rise of a peer competitor, as Washington chooses to call China, that acts in a not neoliberal fashion, is forcing this anti-neoliberal response from governments elsewhere. The final element, I think, is probably the most sort of peculiar, but I think it's critical, which is the rise, especially after the 2008 crash, of a new form of multinational corporation in the form of big tech that you have growing already from the 2000s, but then whose dominance becomes apparent once the banks have been knocked out of the way. The rise of companies like Amazon, like Apple, Microsoft, which had maintained its sort of leading position for decades now. The appearance of this new form of a multinational corporation that would also act against the neoliberal principles. That if the neoliberal principles are the law is going to be observed everywhere and everyone will conduct themselves under this law, whether it's a law for how we protect patents, how intellectual property rights are going to be guarded. And if the other neoliberal principle is everywhere there will be a market and this will set a price, you have companies that actively seek in their business model to undermine both of those things. That in other words, you'll find Facebook as a really classic example of this. That the very process of gathering data from users and trying to monetize that involves Facebook, first of all, deliberately pushing back against laws and regulations to expand the base of data that it can access, to the point where Facebook is adopting a almost quasi-legal function itself to manage that process. The creation of a so-called Supreme Court for Facebook to oversee decisions about the regulations that it's breaking, about how it's going to manage the user data that it's desperately trying to grab, that the entire process of monetizing the data requires you to grab more and more of this stuff, so you're continually in tension and conflict with the laws and regulations, with, in other words, the neoliberal principles on one side, and then on the other is the necessity of not having a market, that if you log on to Facebook, it still says it's free and it always will be, that you don't offer a consumer market because you're doing something different. In other words, there is no price, there is no market. This is not a neoliberal company. And the other data giants work in a similar way, that the attempts to grab and accumulate and analyze and process and monetize data lead them to behave in an anti-neoliberal fashion, with a tension against the laws and regulations as they stand, and frequently just ignoring or manipulating or changing or trying to shape how a market will operate. So you break the principle of law, you break the principle of price. Put all this together, and this is a system. If you think of neoliberalism as a system of governance, as a system of rules and laws, or a system of bureaucratic management, in very, very great tension, that is slowly and steadily being undermined by, if you like, these internal processes. The final bit, I think we would have to put in there, on what's undermining neoliberalism, and this is where potentially, I think, a more optimistic story for the left can emerge, is the simple fact that we now live in a world that is not the stable climactic conditions of the last 200 years, more like 10,000 years, that humanity's enjoyed. That 200 years of industrial capitalism has sufficiently damaged the environment, that has sufficiently dumped enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, ripped up enough resources from various bits of the world, destroyed enough biodiversity, that the stable environmental conditions we've all been used to for basically our entire existence as a human civilization is now severely disrupted. And it's having to cope with those disruptions, whether it's extreme weather events or crop failures of various sorts, or increasing, I would say, pressure on resources of various kinds, as we see most obviously from slightly different causes in the spike in energy prices across Europe in the last year or so. That these different pressures are also acting hard against the neoliberal principles of, can you set a price for something? Can you insist everybody obeys the law around that something? That if you take the price of energy, now subject to very, very hefty and deliberate intervention for domestic users right the way across Europe to try and control that process of resource claims driving up prices, of the breakdown of a neoliberal system. I think most dramatically, again, by the way, in Britain, which has a completely liberalised domestic energy system that the government is now having to intervene massively in, to the tune of probably £150 billion over the next 2 years to try and control and stabilise prices. Completely anti-neoliberal. And these things are going to keep happening. That if there are environmental pressures on capitalism, therefore on all of us, that promote instability, that provoke extraordinary increases in prices, that you'll find governments keep having to intervene to try and control them. None of this adds up to a system that still functions in the neoliberal, according to the neoliberal rules of the game. It doesn't, unfortunately, either add up to a system that is particularly pleasant for anybody who happens to live in it. That sometimes if you say, well, neoliberalism, it's on its way out, especially to a sort of left audience or activists or whatever, on its way out, it's dying. It's not functioning in the way it used to. This isn't how the world operates. First of all, people sort of have a disbelief because I think the ideas have been hegemonic. We've all been used to a world that looks like this, but that's now changing. Second of all, there's a disbelief because people think that if neoliberalism is going, what you get instead is something much better. That if neoliberalism is removed from the picture, capitalism is going to act in a much better fashion afterwards, and we can get back to some sort of nice, happy point in the 1960s with social democracy. None of this really looks like that at this point in time. That the underlying drivers of how capitalism operates, what the system is doing, the relentless drive to create profits in a market-based system, to create surplus value, to exploit, to extract, to accumulate that value, and to do so in a process of desperate competition in different forms across the whole system. None of that has been changed by a change in the form of governance or a breakdown in the form of governance that the death of neoliberalism represents. The underlying drivers of capitalism are all the same. It's just that the neoliberal rules about how you might manage this at the elite level are not working quite as well as they used to. If you put all this together, what starts to emerge is something quite unpleasant, I would say, but different to what the left is used to dealing with, which starts to look like, on one hand, private capitalism having to work more closely with the state, that unlike the sort of neoliberal rules of the game where private capitalism would look to the law, look to the price system, and operate as autonomously as possible from the state, of course, always with plenty of state support. It was never the case that the state disappears. You now have a far closer integration of private capital in the state. Big tech is a very good example of this. The way in which the very large data corporations have leaned and used and seek to exploit their relationship with government to gain an advantage. You can see this in the clash between the US and China over who gets access to the technologies that get used for data extraction. That certain Chinese companies are barred in the US and much of the Western world. Huawei removed from 5G systems, and China responds in kind. It's a relationship between state and private capital which is anti-neoliberal, and it's a far closer relationship than we've been used to seeing in the last, say, 30, 40 years of this period of neoliberalism. That's one part of it. The other part of it is the state itself seeking out ways to intervene in the economy, but not necessarily doing so by reference to wider civil society or democratic values or anything that we might wish to see happen. You get a fusion on both sides, that private capital, in a world in which competition in various different ways is ferocious, in which there are environmental pressures, in which the rules of the game don't seem to function quite as well as they used to, will seek out state support over here, and states on their side, seeing a world that is also chaotic, seeking out to manage that chaotic system as best they can, will also try and work with private capital. You start to get the emergence of something that the economist Laurie McFarlane called authoritarian capitalism, of something where the democratic space that existed to manage this system in various different ways is under pressure, because you have a state and private capital fusion. You have these two elements coming together with their own systemic drives to continue the process of accumulation, of exploitation, of the profit-seeking and profit-making that determine how capitalism operates, but without much reference to wider civil society, the standards and values that we all hold to. Put these two things together with the collapse of neoliberalism, that rather than entering into a world that could be a lot better than the one we're used to, we're quite likely entering into a world that is significantly worse than the one we're used to. That there is a failure of imagination to think that neoliberalism is as bad as things could get, when you start to think about, well, what if we go through neoliberalism and come out the other side with something where the space for democracy is really squeezed, that you have very, very large corporations working directly with the state, using potentially deeply intrusive methods of surveillance, of data gathering, of control over technologies, with limited reference to democratic society and democratic spaces. This is a world that, I'd argue, looks rather different, but also rather worse than the one we've actually seen in the last sort of 30, 40 years of neoliberalism's triumph. So the question is, what do you do about this? How do you sort of block or break some of these things? I think there's three elements for a left strategy in this. The first one is, there has been certainly the last sort of 10 years or so, for the left in Europe, you could see it in Britain certainly, but you can see it right the way across Europe and into the US, and into places that have been on the receiving end of neoliberalism and subjected to neoliberal management and the processes of the last sort of 10, 20 years or so, an understandable revulsion at some of what that means, and a turn to saying, we can use the state to intervene against all of this. That if you have governments in response to the crisis in 2008 attempt to stabilize a neoliberal system, I would argue unsuccessfully, by saying, okay, we will now have austerity, we'll have spending cuts, we'll have more extension of the market, the revulsion of that says, actually, we will not have austerity, we'll expand the state, we'll make these things work better and different by having the state protect us from the market. It's understandable you get that reaction. But if we're moving into a world where the state and capital are working very closely together, right the way across the world, where the leading edge of what capitalism is doing looks like that sort of fusion, it's not good enough to just say, let's have the state. You also have to say, let's make the state work better at the very least. You also have to have a process of how do we democratize the state? How do we break up some of the big institutions that it represents? This is, I think, acute in Britain, where there's no written constitution, for instance, where you have a very weak, limited form of democracy that you get to vote haphazardly every 5 years or so, that there's no obvious democracy even in choosing who gets to be the prime minister at this point in time. It's confined to a small number of Conservative Party members. That the need to break this up and to democratize it should be a primary cause for the left overall. If you then look to what are the social forces that you might relate to as part of that process and that strategy, of not just saying, okay, we can grow the state, we can make the state do more things, that you also want to reform as part of your program how the state operates, at the very least reform how the state operates, who your allies in this sort of democratic push. That you would look to, for instance, not only the trade unions and the necessity of saying we must have independent trade unions that are separate from the states, that can fight for this space of democracy, the space in which autonomy can be exercised against these big institutions that are otherwise dominating our lives. I think you'd also want to start to say, but what about the smaller businesses that are being squeezed out by this process of fusion between state and capital, of this enormous bureaucratic institutions that are appearing, that are so dominant over the economy and society? What are the small businesses that are being squeezed out? You could see this very dramatically in the pandemic. That in terms of the handouts, in terms of the concentration of wealth that was being produced by the state in response to the pandemic in capitalist conditions, which has led to an incredible increase in the wealth of the very, very few people right at the top, and the destruction, if they had not been somewhat supported by the state, of smaller businesses at the bottom. There is an alliance here that can be built between the traditional institutions of the left and the workers' movement and those smaller businesses who are also on the other side of this. The final element in that, I think, is the environmental crisis itself. That the chaos, the instability, the fact that none of this is going to get any better, by the way, that climate change means all of this gets worse, that we're going to be subject to more instability, more shocks, more difficulties in just functioning sort of material life, that there are a set of demands that deal with those, that start to say, how do we manage and mitigate and adapt to a changing world, as well as saying we want to decarbonize, as well as saying we want a Green New Deal. How do you deal with the consequences of climate change and environmental breakdown, and how do you deal with them fairly and effectively? How, for instance, do you start to regulate markets and prices in the interests of workers and their allies? How do you impose price controls on things that are essential to life, whether it's energy, potentially food, and how do you make that work so it gets rid of some of the instability and allows people to live a better life there? In other words, how do you create forms of redistribution that are also a barrier to that kind of instability? I think I can see some of this emerging. I think probably all of us can get some sense at this point in time that these parts can all come together, that the reaction to the cost of living crisis, notably in the US, somewhat in Britain, is an upsurge in workers' struggle of a traditional kind. That the cost of living crisis is itself a product of this environmental instability. It is also a factor in the end of neoliberalism. It is provoking more state intervention. It is these big forces coming together. That the reaction to that, I think, is already a source of hope in all this. So, to wrap up on this point, I don't think neoliberalism is how we should be thinking about how the world is working any longer. I don't think this is a system of governance that is likely to last, but that capitalism itself remains in place, and the pure urge of capitalism to exploit and accumulate remains in place. That means you can get something worse, much worse than neoliberalism, if you have more authoritarian versions of capitalism with more limited bits of democracy in place and more intrusive forms of surveillance and control imposed as part of that. That's a deeply unpleasant place to get to. But the process isn't complete, and there's therefore all these spaces of hope and possibility in the instability of that process, in the instability of climate change and environmental movement, that allow us some reason, I think, to start to imagine, think of, and create alternatives. I'll finish on that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I'll invite the commentators up. First, Hege Skarre will give a comment before Hagen, and then I'll give the word to James for a reply, before we also open up for comments from the audience. So please think of questions and comments.
Thank you. I just sat.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter, I'm very small anyways. It doesn't matter for everyone. You even got a woo. Good job, James. It was great. I want to come back to what you were talking about when it comes to bureaucracy. Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have here. Yep. It's that, yes, states and politicians, they understand, they see the instability, they see the crisis, they know that we need to have state intervention in some ways. But then you have the bureaucrats who are imposing these rules through WTO or other trade agreements. They're not following that same track. They're following the old ways in how we used to do it. So let me explain what that means, because I don't think it's apparent to everyone. We can take one trade agreement that we pushed a lot against a couple of years ago, which was the Trade in Services Agreement. That was in 2015, 2016. We mobilized a lot opposing this agreement in the social movements all over Europe and other places. This was an agreement that the fossil fuel industry wanted, for example. It's the trade in services, so it's the servicification of everything. So if everything's a service, services are liberalized a lot more than commodities, for example. So what they wanted to do with this agreement was to have very stringent clauses on liberalization. So these clauses, which is called the freeze and ratchet clause, for example, that says that this service here, if it's the oil industry, for example, how it's regulated now either has to stay this way forever for all the countries that will be a member of this agreement, or if you're going to do anything with this sector, it can only go one way, and that's more liberalization. So it's either here or this way. So for me, this is to the right. For you guys, this is to the left, so this way. And that is a huge democratic issue, because that freezes the political policy space of all of these countries. And that's not what we wanted. We want more democracy, as you said, because that's vital to be able to change all of this. It's vital for us to actually be able to make a different kind of system. If we don't have democracy, if it's only the industry and their lobby groups and their think tanks that gets to set out what interests we need to follow and make happen, that's not our interests. So we fought against this agreement. We won, we thought. But we didn't really win, because now we see that these freeze and ratchet clauses also popping up in other agreements, because the bureaucrats were given this idea and they just ran with it. So the agreement that we have with the UK after Brexit for the EFTA countries is Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein. They contain these clauses. And that's the first time Norway has ever agreed to an agreement with these clauses. And how you decide what's going to be covered by these clauses is through a commitment list, which is like, we call it a negative list. So everything that you don't want to be under these clauses, you have to put in this list. That's a whole lot of things that you need to put in a list. And you need to have quite a good handle of everything that you need to, or you want to, and in some way, sometime in the future, perhaps regulate in a different way. And to say it politely, Norway fucked up. Because all the other countries put in something that's called new services. So new services is all services after 1991 or something. It's in a list in the WTO, which is called the GATS, but it's very technical. We're not going to go into it. So all services after 1991. The internet, for example, that's a new service. So how do you want to regulate that in moving into the future? So the UK and Iceland and Liechtenstein, they put this in their list. So that when they put in the list, that means we want to have the policy space so that we can go either way. We don't just want to stay here or go this way. But no, I didn't put that in the list. So we spoke to the politicians and we were like, it's not on the list. I'm not on the list. And it just, what usually happens when you have a trade agreement, here in Norway at least, when it comes to the parliament, you say yes or no. And that is not much the politicians can actually do, because the bureaucrats have done all the work. They've been working on it for years and years, and they have a lot of love and hope for this agreement. But what actually happened, that's never happened before, is that we managed to push the government, the politicians, to understand that the bureaucrats fucked up. So that shows to me how the bureaucrats and the politicians aren't really working together. You know, because it's a political issue to be able to regulate your services in the future or now. But the bureaucrats, they weren't awake. They were just doing the same old neoliberal thing. So now that we got, it was the majority vote in the parliament said we want to put the new services in this agreement, or look into maybe being able to sometimes perhaps put it in, the bogus wording, but that's a big thing that happened. It's a huge thing, and I think it underlines what you've been talking about, which is just we're looking at it in a different way, and I think it's very important then that we're more awake to these issues of the bureaucrats still pushing an agenda that isn't working, because this is what's happened. This is why we're all in all of this crisis, and the cost of living crisis, climate crisis, yeah, everything really, inequality. So if we somehow need to just be aware of the rules, think tanks like yours is very important there, and TAC, of course. Yeah. And also, one last thing, you said, what about small business at the end? Facebook, Google, they're pushing that narrative as well. We're here for the small business, or we're important so that women in Uganda can sell their commodities so they can be a part of the global market. And when the crisis hits and you're like, women and children first, you're not in a good place. Because this isn't what they're not here to take care of the small business or women and children. So they're just pushing them so that they can kind of clean themselves of their bad reputation. So just be aware when that happens, that when they go out and they pay someone to do a report on something, that what they're doing is good for small business, just look into it, because it's not. Because it's harming small business more than it's actually helping them. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Great. Excellent. Do you want me to pick up on this?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I guess you need to open, can you hear me? You need to open the mic, maybe?
Is it on?
Doop-da-dap-dap. Yeah, okay. Wow, very loud. Yeah, good to be back. Thanks so much. I was very great. I was very inspired. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, you were not there when I talked yesterday about neoliberalism being exactly what you say, not about more tolerant society, not about a secret club, because that's exactly their narrative, and we're kind of buying into their own fetishization of themselves if we do that. And as a matter of fact, when you, as a historian, yes, we hang out in archives sometimes. When you look at the Montpellerin discussions, one thing they never say, and that's the word neoliberalism. They just don't understand themselves as being, they just don't use it. So that's one thing, what conceptual historians do. Obviously, we follow the word, simple methodological tool, and they don't say it. What do we do then? Where do we find it? And we find it much more often, and just a little bit of a recap from what I said yesterday, in the decades before. And where does it emerge? It emerges precisely in global governance institutions. It emerges precisely in the early constructions of League of Nations and early UNESCO and United Nations conglomerate or settings of institutions, research networks, and so on and so forth. And it's this kind of first generation of think tanks, private foundations, policymakers, research institutions, which are put to the task of solving the big questions. How do we get peace on earth? What's the relation between economic order and social stability? And they're all set to work. And many answers appear from this broad network, and one of them is neoliberalism. And slowly it takes, it wins more and more arguments over time. And the Montpellerin Society, as a matter of fact, is not mainstream at all. That's true at the time. But neoliberal ideas, self-proclaiming neoliberal ideas, was much more in the mainstream than we might think. And even, Keynes's voice was one of them. You know probably better than I do that, the neoclassical synthesis, also with Maurice Allé's, hands in it, had some kind of neoliberal ideas, early neoliberal ideas in that phase of history. So but it's really important that this is about global governance. Neoliberalism is a global order concept. which is, kind of running stale. And it's very important that we don't just follow these. You mentioned, Karl Mannheim's idea of the thought collective, which was picked up by my colleagues, Philip Morawski and Dieter Pleve, in their famous Road from Mont Pelerin book, which until then, or after that, we all kind of open the next, what's the history of Mont Pelerin in Bolivia, or in, this, people are writing that, and that takes us nowhere. And poor Dieter, he's often now confronted with exactly what you say, but it's, we don't have to look at the Mont Pelerin Society all the time. And he said, yeah, I know, guys. It was just a heuristic tool. It was just a great way to open up a network and to see how connected they were, what are the interesting players, and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, the Institute for Economic Affairs wasn't the first one, but that's, we can see it in the Aktionsgemeinschaft Soziale Marktwirtschaft in Germany, founded in the 50s, doing exactly the same. It's this, as I mentioned before, this kind of mutually sustaining network of think tanks and government organizations that bring up these ideas. It was the ASM in Germany that in the 50s provided that the concept of social market economy, a decisively neoliberal concept, by the way, gained hegemony in Germany, and we can follow that pattern in other countries as well. So that was the first part of my talk, just to show you that, you don't need to, I was trying to be, to live up to what you said. Oh, there's a conceptual story, and I need to be, I tried to be more evil, or to be kind of, no, I agree with what you say. But it also leaves me to the second part of my comments, which would be about the dystopian aspect that I find also coming from your talk. So it's pretty sad where we are right now, no? And now the big tech is schmoozing with the state, and we have a kind of strange combination of the political with the economic, and there's no way of actually criticizing, undermining in democratic ways. The public sphere or the Twitter sphere, it may be an outrage, but there's no real checks and balances on that. And that's probably moving us to an authoritarian / maybe fascist regime. And we see it happening in many, many parts of the world, that authoritarianism is pretty strong. So what to do? And in my field, where we try to, in humanists and social scientists, thinking about globalization and global theories, one of the things that we increasingly talk about is the term planetary. That would be something, a new page, because we're so depressed, or we keep thinking in circles when we think about the global. The global is full of hierarchies: the global north, the global south, globalization, capitalism, creating inequalities. It's so full. Every time you use the word global in an analysis, you need to classify, you need to describe, define. So when when Dipesh Chakrabarty, for example, last year published his book on climate change and planetary history, that was one of the first publications in a movement of scholars where thinking planetarily opens up a new way, a broad way of thinking. Why? Because planetary is, hopefully you have the same associations as I do. It doesn't have any hierarchies. It connects the human and the non-human. It brings the environment and human agency together. It allows us to open new spaces of thinking. And it also allows new ways of analyzing or moving in as humanists and social scientists, and I think and political economists here as a social scientist, to open their mouth and voices and open a chapter that is maybe hopefully not as dystopian, because as you say, what do we see right now? In the gap that is left after globalization is dying, let's just say globalization and what you described as neoliberalism is one kind of narrative, which for a long time, even though we liked it or not, was part of our imagination of the future. Mm-hmm. And somehow the future is, not only is neoliberalism dead, but I feel the future is kind of dead. I have a hard time imagining a utopian, nice future. So we need to do something about that. We need to create new futures, positive templates towards which, to work for, and towards which we also then rewrite history. And the planetary alternative seems to be one that is, in this gap that seems to be filled with populists, authoritarians, now war and crazy things happening. The planetary is also, I think, a hope for where we can bring ideas of resources together with democracy, resource democracy. I mentioned it this morning at breakfast. For the first, economic democracy could be back. New forms of global governance need to be thought. For example, why do we still have global governance as and it's just an interstate system? International law is a system between laws. Could we be more imaginative here and say global governance should also be about, ecological spheres, areas which cut across countries, and they maybe have different legal regimes than the nation state. It's kind of a weird idea that the sovereignty of a forest belongs to this country here, but the forest goes on, but the other part of the forest belongs to another country, so it's a different legal regime. What do we do about this? If we think planetarily, I think there's a new, kind of more positive imagination possible. And with this more positive note, I don't want to repeat my frustration with the left thinkers when, for example, when they return to exactly what you say, this kind of happy 60s. Mm-hmm. And that cannot be the solution. I mean, Wolfgang Streeck, he keeps returning to the 50s and 60s and keeps returning to the small nation state. Well, that, to my mind, isn't the solution. So we need to keep thinking globally. Like the neoliberals did, but in different ways. Let me stop here.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks again. Do you want to reply to that?
Yeah, all right. Well, thanks for that. There's a lot to pick up on there. I mean, your point about trade in particular, which is one of these bits I mean, zombie neoliberalism is one way to talk about it. That might be sort of overstating or understating the case in some ways. Trade I find fascinating because it's the bit where neoliberalism is supposed to work, right? That you do actually remove barriers to trade. You are now allowed to trade things that conceptually couldn't even think of as trading, some decades ago. The idea that you can patent the genetic structure of a plant and this can be traded. I mean, that's an incredibly sort of aggressive version of neoliberalism right there. It's a real intrusion. And I'll come back to, because I think your point about the planetary is crucial. It's an intrusion on sort of material life itself that you're imposing, and this trading is open to trade. And the peculiarity, I think, you see, as neoliberalism, as a system of global governance is on its way out, is that you do get these really quite aggressive trade agreements on the way there. The digital trade, so-called in particular, really, it's just a way of regulating how we use lots and lots of data technologies. The one that springs to mind is because Brexit has unfortunately forced all of us to have to think about trade a bit more in Britain than we used to, is the UK-Japan deal and its rules over, or rather sort of lack of rules, over how data that is produced by users can be treated when it moves across borders between the UK and Japan. And okay, it's presented as free trade. What it actually means is this is now a strongly deregulated regime, that you have very, very few rights in terms of this deal over what is done with that data. And it's quite a, within the collapse and decline of neoliberalism, you get this kind of aggressive reassertion of it. That was with Liz Truss as the trade minister who signed the deal, and you get something similar now she's prime minister. That there's an attempt, an aggressive reassertion of a neoliberal way of operating that I think is going to come a cropper. It's not going to work. It's already produced this ferocious market and institutional reaction because it's kind of out of kilter with just operations across the rest of the planet. So that, I think, is... There's a version of this where, it's lashing out. The old way of working, I'm not going to quote Gramsci on this point because everyone does, but it's like the old way of working is still there. It's still in people's heads. It's not clear what comes next, and you get versions of a neoliberal resurgence which has this pushback. The general tendency, I think, is very much against it. Yes, well, I'm glad we're in agreement about the Mont Pelerin Society, so, fuck those guys. And also, maybe we don't talk about them anymore. Maybe that's, they'll just pretend they're not there and they'll go away. But you're also right that it gives, because it gives such a nice story, right? There is a crisis. These people had ideas and they were able to make the crisis work. We're in a crisis. We have ideas. Maybe it'll work for us this time, right? It's kind of a nice thing to tell yourself. Unfortunately, it's not really what happened then, and it's probably not going to be what happens now. That we have some good ideas, but this is a fight. And this is backwards and forwards, and things change, and it's a struggle. And you can't just go, here is our plan for everything, now we're going to implement it. We're having to deal with a very chaotic situation that requires contingent responses. And that, I think, is something the neoliberals were good at, which is that in the midst of a crisis, what is the next step? Not what is the utopia, that's kind of there, but what is the next thing you do? And that's probably the point to get to. I mean, on this, the specific thing about talking about the idea of the planetary rather than global is that it reintroduces, and this is the critical part, and this is the bit that I think we have something on our side, it reintroduces the idea of a non-human world.
Exactly.
That neoliberalism is very, at heart, it's very socially constructivist. When you ask people about how they think about things, it is, we are people, we create the world, and everything is there for us to either exploit, or it's what we imagine it to be. We imagine a thing called a patent, this can be applied to a plant, and then that happens, then that's the world you create. The problem they've got is that this process has gone so far that there's a rebound from nature against some of that. The process of capitalist exploitation is being pushed far enough that it's getting this immense blowback in various different forms. That suddenly the non-human imposes itself on us in really dramatic ways. I mean, COVID, frankly, is a version of that. That this non-human, tiny thing radically reshapes how we live our lives for a period, and actually probably ongoing for a bit. The non-human is still there, and that is a chaotic element in all of this that we can, I wouldn't say use to our advantage, that's not quite the right thing to say, but we can at least reshape how we think about the world and therefore think about everything else that exists and our material existence as people. Depending on all of this, that gives us a notion of care. And I liked your idea in particular of once you start to conceptualize this, the idea of nation states, of specific legal structures that are bound by them, that maybe there's a global thing, but really that's just about regulating nation states and the relations between them, it breaks down. Exactly as you say, you can't, what's the point in drawing a border down a forest? The forest is just there. Once you think about how you manage that resource or care for and nurture that resource, it's useless to put a border down the middle of it. You can quite radically reconceptualize how you think of the world. So yes, let's hear it for the non-humans. That's my closing remark.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Are there any comments or questions? Okay, there are hands raising. I see 3 hands. Could we do three comments and questions in a row and then come back to the panel? Please.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in this. So there seems to be an inconsistency between neoliberalism in theory and practice. Is it fair to say that neoliberalism have always been contradictory? I mean, from the anti-government, anti-state rhetoric of Thatcher and Reagan. In reality, state expenditure stayed the same from Thatcher came into government and when she left, 17 years later. Reagan is one of the most protectionist presidents the US has had with regards to trade and tariffs, for instance. So how are these two things reconciled? I mean, the differences between neoliberalism in theory and praxis in the global north. And also the other question is, there are countries that has developed, is it fair to say they have done so by radically interfering with market principles? When the multilateral institutions celebrate the effects of structural adjustment programs, for instance, and the eradication of extreme poverty under the Millennium Development Goals, the data is backdated to include the poverty eradication in China, which has had massive state programs and interventions in the economy and has not followed the IMF conditions. Is it fair to say that neoliberalism, the neoliberal gospel of privatization, deregulation, of free trade, has been imposed on the global south with devastating results, while the economies in the global north have broken the neoliberal rules? For instance, NAFTA decimated Mexican agriculture, who couldn't compete with heavily subsidized American agribusiness, while global south countries are not allowed to subsidize their own industries under the WTO regime. So is it fair to say that the countries in the global north have developed economically by breaking the neoliberal gospel that are imposed on the others? And the last sentence, with these inconsistencies, does this impact the usefulness, do you think, of neoliberalism as an analytical tool in political science?
Thanks. Could we do one more question?
Yeah.
Or
So there were a couple there. The first one.
maybe from.
Yeah.
From thank you. If that's okay.
Oh, sorry, my mic's on.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Nice. I was wondering about, you talked a bit about corporatism, or like the private sector working together with the state. And I was wondering, dismantling hierarchy, how are we supposed to tackle that, like, in praxis? Because in Europe right now we have like a fascist wave, and this push against neoliberalism is faced with more fascism and authority. And I was wondering, how can we as socialists push for stuff like protectionism and against social hierarchy, when so many people feel a need for someone to just get stuff done and just fix everything, because people are so tired of having to work so much? How can we dismantle like modern hierarchy, and how can we fight for that?
Thank you. Should we do a third one, or is this?
We should take the third one. Yeah.
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah. Is that all right?
Yep. There was a hand down here by the.
Yeah, you've briefly mentioned, I think it was you who mentioned how Facebook tells people that they really support these small businesses, and these, you took an example of women in Uganda and etc. Facebook isn't the only company who says this. In general, Silicon Valley in America has tried to be socialist in their reports and their marketing skills, trying to help small businesses. Elon Musk is a person who's really it's a lot of him in the media. He is really popular amongst a lot of these new thinkers, and yeah, I'll just cut it short. How does the Silicon Valley and this wave of TikTok, social media, and etc., how does this work with the neoliberalism? Because I know that there is a strong connection between the two. It is not at all a socialist movement, and it spreads the gospel further. So what are your thoughts on the social and Silicon Valley and neoliberalism?
Thank
What's
you.
the last thing you said?
How Silicon Valley and neoliberalism works together.
Silicon Valley.
Thank you. Maybe we should start with James and then.
Totally.
All right, thank you. Wow. All right, there's quite a lot there. Let me try and pick up on some of the things. On the contradictions in neoliberalism. I mean, that's partly why I think it's worth thinking about it as a sort of a way of operating rather than an ideal that will be imposed. Like, successful neoliberalism is a guide on what to do next, rather than like, here's your vision of the future. You can talk about how great it's all going to be in the future, but it's like what you do next is where it really becomes useful. And eventually, when the what you do next gets you so much success that you've defeated the workers' movement basically globally for a decade, that you just have these big institutions that are imposing a kind of neoliberal order, and that's your utopia. Utopia is 2000 and Tony Blair's in Downing Street, and Bill Clinton is still just about in Washington, and everybody's very happy, right? That's the vision that we're all supposed to be sort of thinking about as the peak of neoliberalism. But that's what you get to once you've kind of stumbled into it, because you've done all these little attacks on the way. So if you take Thatcher and Reagan, I mean, Thatcher's really, you're absolutely right, that they actually, Reagan imposes loads of protectionism, which clears the way for having not protectionism in the future, right? It's a deliberate move in defense of US corporations that helps create this neoliberal future world without those protections. Thatcher, I was really struck by this. Thatcher, everyone knows she took on the trade unions and defeated them, all terrible. The very first thing she did, just about on arriving in office, was to pay a 25% pay increase to public sector workers in Britain. And that was after the strikes over 1978 to 79. And she did this because she didn't want strikes. Right? So you just pay. You just use the state to pay people off. And she did this repeatedly during her time in office. Liz Truss has just done the same thing. Massive free marketeer. Like, she really does believe in this utopian vision of the future with a free market for everything, and it's all going to be great. First thing she did is, on becoming Prime Minister, is pay £150 billion to freeze everybody's energy bills for the next 2 years. It's to buy some space. It's to buy some time. They'll use the state like this. If you're in the heroic period, especially. In the managerial period of neoliberalism, that isn't necessary because you've defeated all your enemies, so everything's stabilized. So I think that's the kind of contradiction there. You're right on the North versus South. I probably didn't talk enough about this. There is a peculiarity, and this is a space for hope, actually, is that as the system of governance has weakened, it has opened spaces where people can do different things. Like the weakening of neoliberalism as a global institution or global set of rules meant that for a long period of time in South America, you can get governments that did things differently because they've opened up a space. The more that system of rules has weakened, the more the institutions have weakened, the more space has been created. So it's chaotic. It's not regulated like it used to be. There's all sorts of ways where this can break down even into war and violence, as we've seen. But it also creates a space where different things can happen. That I think is an important point there. But it also means that the concept of North versus South starts to break down somewhat. Where does China sit in that dichotomy, for instance? I mean, you can kind of place it either way if you want. It doesn't quite fit how the world is changing. I'll take the point about fascism and hierarchy and what do we actually do about this, because I think it gets to the nub of the problem. I think there are, in a chaotic world, demands for state intervention, which I think, on the whole, we should be there making those demands. We have to take the example of energy prices in Britain. The campaign to refuse to pay the increase in the energy bill was started by the left. It started by a bunch of basically anarchists, really, who set up a web page. With enormous success, the government did eventually implement a policy that more or less froze bills. I mean, that's quite a significant step. The far right in Britain were furious about this because they wanted to take the initiative to be the people. And you could see them, they were really seething. They kept saying, oh, it's a bunch of communists, a bunch of communists doing this, don't sign up to the campaign, right? They were seething and furious about it. So I think first thing is we have to be faster. We have to make the demands that'll say this is what we should impose in a situation of crisis. So you say, do this thing. For the next step, I think there's also, we have to have that level of cynicism about what the state can do, which means that we also need to say, we're the people who best defend and extend the kind of liberal democratic rules that we now have. That we want the state to intervene, but we want to make certain that it is transparent, that it is democratic, that is these lists of things also, that is not just about a pure power intervention. Now that gets you to a point where maybe for some on the left, more traditional socialists, you spend a long time just sneering at liberals. It gets you to a point where you say, actually, we're going to have to work with some of these people because we're talking about the same sets of values, the same sets of ideas, the same sets of what the state might look like there. So I think those are the two bits, if that makes sense. Like, be quick, get in first, take the initiative. If it's a situation that is chaotic, and it is, you have to be the people first out of the block. If you want to say what you're going to do next, we have to look for allies elsewhere and not spend quite so long sneering at liberals if somebody's turning up as a massive authoritarian fascist, right? It's just daft. Do you want to pick up? I don't know.
I can at least pick up on the question that you had. We wouldn't have Silicon Valley or the internet without the US government or the US military. So the kind of answer to your question on neoliberalism and Silicon Valley, it's through subsidization and contracts that we have the Silicon Valley that we have today. The internet was an extremely expensive thing to build. It's infrastructure. Silicon Valley and the platforms that they have or they provide as well, they are also infrastructures. And bit by bit, we just privatize the hardware, which is cords, or if it's the machines that we use, we've privatized the software, and we've also privatized us. So we are the commodity. We're not the users. We are creating the product that they are now earning billions on, so that they can go into space, so that Elon Musk can finally have his childhood dream of living on Mars. Yeah. That's what's happened.
In a tiny house.
In a tiny little home. Hope he crash and burns on the way there. But so yes, it's an incredibly important thing to remember, that the internet and what they do, it's government contracts. That's how we got there. So it's not really neoliberalism that's in a way come after. And then we have this shift now, which is, it's the same thing. It's just, they had these government contracts all over. How we, Facebook here in Oslo, for example, you have the municipalities been using Facebook Workplace. The same as NRK, Norwegian BBC, use Facebook Workplace as their, like, how they communicate with each other at work. So these are also how we subsidize Silicon Valley through government funding.
Yeah, well, okay, I mean, I could add something, but I don't know. Should I?
Yeah, or there was another hand, so if that's okay.
No, I don't mind.
We have 3 minutes, and I think we'll have time for one brief question and a reply from here, and I'm sorry for...
Give it to James.
I'll try to keep it brief. English is not the language that I use daily, and not when I work politically. I'm a teacher, and I'm full-time union representative, and I believe that as English is not what I use to debate on a day-to-day basis. Talking about neoliberalism is not how I convince my fellow union members about how to fight. I would like to know if you have any comment on what's the language we will use to engage people, because the changes we're talking about needs a movement. And well, this is obviously many people being politically active and wanting to be part of a movement, but we can see what touches people is not the debate about whether neoliberalism should be called by another name, but the fact that we're not able to pay our electrical bills. And people are very well informed about the environmental crisis, but when you can't pay your electric bill, you would rather you will burn wood, even though you know it's bad for the air that people breathe in the city. I'm one of many that do that now because we can't manage our bills. And when there's a crisis, people will look to themselves. And how do we talk about economic politics in a way that make people see that they can act themselves? I believe there are too many of us who are paid to think on behalf of people and act on behalf of people, and we are too well paid in addition to that. This is a problem. We don't feel the troubles other people live in. Thank you.
James, do you have a brief reply to that?
Well, yeah, no, I think it's an absolutely spot on, perfect point to make. Look, this is a crisis. It is not going to end. If we don't find a way to relate to people and talk to them and talk about their problems and come up with ideas that will resolve those problems, we will not win. So I'm very happy to have a big kind of strategic discussion about where the world is going and what's going on. But the nub of it is, how do we convince millions of people that even with this chaos and everything that is happening in the world, it is still possible to get something better? That's the nub of it. And I think that's a really difficult question for all of us to deal with, right? It's not easy because the world is chaotic. So hopefully we can think a bit about how it is chaotic, and hopefully by thinking about it, we come up with some answers. But right now, I think you're absolutely right. And that's what I mean about the intervention. Act. Say what needs to be doing and do it. And if people agree with it, they'll join you. I mean, it's like, this is a moment to not sit around, although we are all sitting around. It's a time to get up and do something about it. And it's not going to get any better unless we do that. So it's a very good point.
Great. Thank you so much. We are over our time and we have to round off. But thank you so much, James, Hege, and Hagen, and for questions and comments. Thanks.